Thank you for tuning in to the Natural State podcast. This week, I have Chris Irvin back on the show for yet another Q&A episode. I think this is 12, 13, 14, something like that. We chat about a lot of updates of basically what we've been eating and how we've been thinking about health for ourselves recently. It's I'd say changed a little bit, but yeah, we get into a lot of stuff around what's our current carb intake, how we think about vegetables, what breakfast is going on. And then big news for Chris, him and his wife are having a kid soon. So some advice around pregnancy and how you should approach that for your child. So a lot of action-packed stuff in here. If you guys have any more questions that you want us to answer, we love doing these episodes. They're really fun for us to make sure we stay connected and answering questions that people have. So just shoot them to me or him. Instagram works best for me at Dr. Anthony Gustin or Chris the Ketologist, and we'll answer your questions as soon as we get them or shortly after that. So tune into this one, and I hope you guys enjoy. This episode of The Natural State is sponsored by Ned. Ned is an incredible company that makes a lot of CBD products, and you guys can probably go back to some of my episodes and realize that I have been a CBD skeptic for a very long time. I think that it's really hard in this industry that's exploding to have really high quality products that actually do anything. I tried a bunch of different CBD brands before this one, and unless they had THC in them as well, not enough to get high, but just enough to amplify the effects of CBD, I didn't feel anything until I tried Ned and then was completely blown away. I'd been using their products before they sponsored the show for about 4 to 6 months and have noticed a huge increase the nights that I use their product, about 25 milligrams, so 50 milligrams per night of the CBD. And I sleep way better. But then also the most interesting part is my HRV as tracked by my Oura Ring the next morning is about 20 points higher the day that I use CBD versus not. I also have not been doing a lot of social drinking as of this year. So anybody who's been following my stuff knows that I've sort of been taking the backseat to any sort of glass of wine here, drink there, to take the edge off. And the last few months, I'm sure everybody in the world feels a little stressed out. And I've been doing the same amount, like 25 to 50 milligrams to sort of replace that glass of wine to wind down and de-stress. And it's been pretty remarkable to pull down the edge and make sure that I can just calm down at night with all that's going on in the world. The founders are amazing people. They really care about their supply chain, their sourcing. They do things the right way. And I asked them to hook you guys up with a little bit of a discount code. So if you want to try Ned out, just go to helloned.com/AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. That's HELLONED.com/AG15. That's AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. Hello, Chris.
What's up, AG?
Welcome, my friend, to another episode.
It's been a little bit.
Remember when this was called Keto Answers podcast? That was a weird time.
I was just thinking about that the other day. I think are we over a year now that you've made the change to Natural State?
Yeah, it was last January.
Last January. Wow. Doesn't seem like that long ago. We were Keto Answers, pumping out all the keto content.
Yeah, it turns out life involves more than ketogenic diets, but we got a bunch of questions still, even though, again, we wrote the book on it. Many other people wrote great books. I've done a couple hundred blog posts, many podcasts, yet the questions keep flowing in.
268 of them in the book, and I think there's a couple here that are not answered in there. So maybe we have to come out too. Volume
2. So you still are the ketologist, though. So this is why I wanted to have you on, chat through this stuff.
Oh,
You're the expert.
Next appearance.
Yeah, you're the expert here. So
right.
Yeah, number one, let's just lead it off with, is keto bad for gut health? And again, since you're the keto expert, I want you to sort of fill this in.
Well, I think the answer to this one is probably the famous answer we always give to questions like this. And it depends, right? So probably depends on what version of keto you're doing. I think that the version of keto that most people are following nowadays with a ton of processed keto foods. Just saw that General Mills came out with canola oil packed keto cereal. I think that version sounds delicious, doesn't it?
Love it.
Put some oat milk on top, and I think you have a recipe for gut health, right?
Yeah, oat milk though is keto. So.
Oh, that's true. Too high sugar or what?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, that's the version of keto I would say is bad for gut health. I think when we're talking about like a whole food version of keto where you're eating, meat, leafy green vegetables, low glycemic fruits, and then those few keto snacks that are out there that actually have whole food ingredients in them. There's not many of those left, but there's a few. I think that version of keto can be great for gut health. But yeah, I think what it's become now in mainstream, definitely not.
I think you'd ask a couple different questions here. Is one, what type of ketogenic diet are you doing? Like you said, this can look like literally just guzzling vegetable oils and having super processed foods, and that's not going to be good for your health. I mean, there's a lot of inflammatory effects that can happen in your gut from having these highly oxidized oils. But if you're doing it with clean, local sourced foods, I think it can be a really great thing. Again, it really depends on sort of your background and your history as well. Some people that switch over from eating a super high fiber diet, high carbohydrate diet to a ketogenic diet, or they're not getting any of these things again. You may have a little bit of a transition time, and that's just fine as your microbiome adjusts. It depends how long sort of you've taken to go into ketosis versus if it's just you were eating high carb processed food one day and then completely opposite the next. I think you can have a transition time. It doesn't mean it's bad for gut health.
Mm-hmm.
You may have a little bit less of a diversity than before, but I think the diversity game in gut health is a really simplistic view on it, and you should probably be looking at gut barrier like permeability and some of this stuff more than how many species exist in your colon.
Yeah. I think it's kind of an interesting way to look at it when you're saying like it also depends where you're coming from with your diet. Like if you're coming from the standard American diet into a keto diet, no doubt you're going to see gut health improvements, right? Like you're going to be cutting out, even if you're not cutting out all of the foods that are triggering, bad gut health, you're going to be cutting out a lot of them by just removing processed carbs. But then, I do think that you probably end up with those cases of people who have gut issues from, crazy high fiber intake, right? Or like, people consuming 50, 100 grams of fiber. I think we have a question on that maybe in here as well. So I think that, I think that plays a big role into it too. Like, what is your diet currently like? Like if you're on keto now, or, you've been following like say a carnivore diet for gut health, and then you introduce like a bunch of, vegetables and stuff like that, it could probably cause that gut health to maybe go the other way. So that, I think that's a big role too.
All right. I think a lot of the questions next pertain to how we're consuming food now and lately. So the one is to roll into it.
Yeah. So next question we have is are you still following a ketogenic lifestyle? Not diet, lifestyle. All right. Come on now.
Oh man. I don't know. Have I ever really been super, super strict, crazy? Maybe, probably at times, but I guess I've never really looked at it from a perspective of a lifestyle more than experimenting with foods and figuring out what makes me feel best. And I've always sort of gone back and forth eating carbohydrates, and so I've never really been that much of a zealot or a dogmatic person when it regards to ketogenic diet or lifestyle. I don't know how lifestyle plays in more of that. How would you think about lifestyle being more of a determinant?
I guess, I think it depends on what you mean by lifestyle. Like, I think what keto lifestyles become nowadays is like that you're like hardcore and you like that, following keto lifestyle means you follow it forever. I think what keto lifestyle could probably mean is just having an understanding of like carb tolerance, how to manipulate carbs for different goals and, when to consume carbs and when not to consume carbs. I think that like, you and I are both probably in this state where like we have a pretty good understanding of what foods react well to our bodies and which don't. So we don't really look at our diets as like, oh, I'm following keto for this next 30 days, or I'm following, carnivore. Like, I don't know about you, but like for me, it's like day to day, I look at like, what do I need? It's like, I'm trying to, gain weight and I'm, exercising a bunch more, like I'm probably going to eat more carbs. Like I've found that works pretty well. If I'm trying to like, shred up a little bit, or maybe I want to like focus more on like work projects and stuff like that. Like, I might, cycle in some low carb days, some fasting, some keto. But it's very dynamic and it really changes, based on like, what it is that I'm trying to achieve. So if we're talking about that version of a keto lifestyle, then I would say yes. But if we're talking about following keto all the time, then no.
Yeah. I think I eat lower carb some days and higher carb other days.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't test my ketones religiously, but I'm sure if I did, most of the time I would have them present in my bloodstream. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm just a pretender. Maybe I'm just a ketogenic pretender at this point. Which is okay. I'm okay with.
Get to right? Like, wouldn't it be good to get to a point where you don't have to call what you're doing by a name? They're like, oh, I'm keto, or oh, I'm carnivore or paleo or whatever. You can just eat because you know what to eat and stuff. You don't have to, track and count everything. Like, I kind of think that should be the goal that we should try to get to.
Yeah, I think it should be the goal. I think that a species appropriate diet should be a goal. Feeling healthy should be a goal, and not having to worry about food and being able to enjoy it. If you want to enjoy it, sure. But yeah, not having it have to be such a specific thing. I think that the reason why we have to think about it as a thing that we have to manage is because we're so far away from eating foods that we should be eating. And so that leads us to being diabetic or fat or sick or whatever, or low energy. And so you can use a lot of different diets. And I think ketogenic diets are a phenomenal tool to help reverse some of those things.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think that many things in health, sleep, diet, exercise, et cetera, are really just, they're things we have to focus on and pay attention to and put energy into, because we are not living in a normal environment for humans. We're living in a zoo, and the zookeeper's been feeding us a bunch of weird pellets of food. And we're trying to escape the zoo. And to escape the zoo, we have to figure out all these little tricks and in different paths. And this is just one path to get out of the zoo. But once you're out of the zoo, like you said, it's not something that you should really be worrying about. So I guess if I were to live any lifestyle, I'm trying to live a more human lifestyle, and what the human species is designed for. And I think that's eating local, seasonal, real foods. And we can get into that a little bit later with vegetables and what vegetables or fruits I'm eating, things like that. But a lot of animal products for sure. Otherwise, I'm getting most of my produce from local farmers markets, whatever's grown seasonally. We can get some nuance in that in a little bit, but that's, I guess, how I would think about my lifestyle. The human.
Yeah, it's like when you get to that point, you don't really have to think about, because when you've cut out like certain foods from your diet, like you're no longer considering eating Pop-Tarts, right? And considering eating like sugary cereals and stuff like that. And it's like when you cut those out and you have like, these are the foods that I eat as a human, like you said, like the optimal human diet. Like some of those foods have carbs, some of them don't, but it's like, you're not thinking about that as much. You're more of just like, sticking to those foods and then just kind of eating appropriately. And I think it's when when we still want to try to get all of the, like you said, we're trying to continue eating that food that's coming from like the zookeeper. And it's like, that's when we have to be on these special diets, right? It's like, okay, I want to have, these sugary carbs in my life. So I need to give myself some sort of like, stop point. Like, I can only have this many of those so that I don't go over. But when you're not having those foods anymore, then you don't really have to have those same kind of controls in place. So it seems. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, like you said, the goal should be not to have to worry about it. I mean, I think that should be the case with every sort of health parameter. I don't think we should need to have weird little bio trackers and glucose monitors and all sort of stuff. We should figure out what works for us as humans. I think a lot of this stuff just fixes itself. I mean, time with the Hads in Africa is like really taught me a lot of this. And I knew it all already, but it's just like to learn it and be like, oh yeah, it's like so simple. Like when you live outside, which is where we belong, you don't have to worry about sleeping, because everything is just like, you wake up when it's light and you go to bed when it's dark.
Right.
You're tired at the end of the day because you're not stimulated by screens, stressed out, eating a shitty diet, inside, having no circadian rhythm. Like whereas our sort of environment we have now, we have to manage it so delicately. I have this filter on my phone. I have glasses I have to wear. I have lights that change color. I have like a shutdown routine, my temperature control, my bed changes temperatures. It's like this elaborate thing that I have to think about and then track my sleep.
Right.
You don't need to do that when you're in a proper environment. Now, there's obviously some balance of like trying to figure out the middle ground of, we live in a crazy zoo right now. How do you balance that with not just having to go live in the woods, which is frankly impossible at this point.
Right.
And so there's a delicate point there, but it's about like figuring out how to get things out of the way so I can focus on enjoying my life and doing good work that I'm proud of.
Right.
So I think that nutrition is just one of those things. And I think that I'm sort of past thinking about it as a ketogenic tool and more as like a species appropriate tool.
Right. Love it. All right. Well, let's keep going then. So next question is what is your current carb intake?
I don't know. I would say
space. Be careful here. We don't want you to get canceled here.
What's that?
First, if this is too high, you're probably going to be canceled in the keto space.
I thought this was a safe space.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what the listeners are like nowadays.
So yeah, carb intake. I would say again mimics the natural surroundings and the environment, and like we're starting to get more carbs right now in Central Texas, so I'm eating way more of those. When I was in Costa Rica and Miami and Africa, I was eating tons of carbs, probably 150 plus grams a day via fruit. and it felt incredible. I ate less when I came back here in late March, early April. And now I'm eating more because strawberries and other berries and things like that are coming in the season. So it's just like, again, comes with whatever's around. I've noticed that increasing carbohydrates a little bit more around meals, or not around meals, like when I'm more active, just feels better for me lately. And I think that typically when it gets warmer out, I want to go with higher carb, lower fat. And when it gets colder out, I want to go higher fat, lower carb. It's just instinctually sort of like what I crave. Maybe that's some genetics due to family history of like where my ancestors came from versus just even where I'm at locally. But I'd say a little bit higher, probably 75 grams ish a day on days where I make a point of it, maybe a little bit higher. But it's not something that I track diligently. What about yourself?
Do you keep protein constant when you like throughout the seasons?
Again, I don't measure, but I'd say, yeah, pretty much the same.
Yeah, so you're not
a pound and a half to 2.5 pounds of meat a day, I'd say. Yeah, roughly.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, carb intake for me. So I am actually focusing on having a little bit higher carb intake, which is kind of a hard thing to do when you're talking about like whole food carb sources. Like it's not easy to, unless you're like, pounding like a lot of rice and stuff like that. Like, I'm kind of more of like, fruit, sweet potatoes. That's really been like the carb sources that I use. And I'm shooting for probably somewhere between like 100 to 125 grams a day right now. And it's kind of been challenging to get. Like I've been using the Equip sweet potato powder after my workouts. I usually put that in with protein. Then doing like either, fruit, some sort of fruit throughout the day, some Greek yogurt, stuff like that. And then, sweet potatoes usually for dinner. And I've been doing that for probably 4 weeks now, I would say. And I've been tracking my blood sugar during it. And I would say my fasting blood sugar is trending a little bit higher. So, typically I'm down in like the high 70s, low 80s. Lately, I've been more in like the high 80s, low 90s. So still, a range that I feel pretty comfortable in, but it is starting to creep up. So, that's usually a gauge for me. Like if I start seeing it get, over like 100 or like upper 90s, then I'll usually either, scale it back or start putting in some fasting or something like that. But yeah, so right now I'm around like 100 to 125.
Interesting. One of the really interesting findings that I found when I was eating way more fruit in Africa and Miami and Costa Rica is that the spikes after I ate fruit were pretty large, but came back to baseline relatively soon. And I think that what we'll find later on is that we're going to be demonizing these spikes of glucose and then realizing like, oh shit, it actually doesn't matter as long as it returns to baseline. Right. In a reasonable amount of time, which I think would be 45 to 90 minutes after a meal, and not a sustained and like irregular pattern after that, like goes back down, stays stable after you eat.
Right.
But what happened after like 2 or 3 weeks is my fasting blood glucose actually went down significantly.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It was like 85, 90, whatever, and then went down to like low 70s, high 60s after I was eating carbohydrates for like 3 or 4 weeks. Now, there were a lot of other factors at play here. I was also outside pretty much all day, every day in that 6-week span. And like, I wonder, okay, there's so many things that when you put it together from an environmental perspective, probably make a lot more sense. And I wonder if there's something like, if you're eating a lot of fruit, a lot of carbs, you should probably be getting way more sunshine, meaning like those things are ripe when the sun, like I was eating sun fruits, basically like things that get ripe in sun. And so I wonder if this is like some sort of like concentration of vitamin D or other factors in the sunshine where you can process carbohydrates way better. The spikes actually got way more controlled or way lower. My fasting blood glucose was lower after like a 3 or 4 weeks. It was crazy. It was pretty remarkable, especially like pineapple. When I first started eating it was huge spike. And then my blood sugar was crash and it would be irregular afterwards and then it would stabilize. And then after a couple of weeks of eating it and being outside a bunch and I guess not working as much, not being as stressed, it normalized quite a bit. So
wow. I'm sure getting a better sleep too, because like that was right after your Africa trip, right? Probably had like, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So because I think sleep, at least for me, I've noticed is a big thing with my fasting blood sugar, where if I'm not getting good sleep or, getting short sleep, like I'll wake up and my blood sugar will be, cranked up like, 100 to 110.
Yeah.
Way higher than normal. So that's probably another thing too. Like if you're getting quality sleep during that time, I think a lot of that stuff probably makes a bigger difference than the carb intake itself.
Yeah. I was getting fine sleep in Africa.
Yeah.
Which is like a couple of days after I got there, where were a little shaky because of jet lag, and then coming back was a little weird. But I got COVID right when I came back, and I was sleeping like 12 hours a day and was just passed out most of the time. So I felt totally fine with that. Like I skipped jet lag on the way back,
Right.
luckily. But yeah, sleep was fine the whole time. And also it was another finding is that, but by the time I came back from Africa, my blood glucose had been way more stable. I went to Miami, obviously I had COVID. There's some other factors there, but the food like didn't taste good. Like the fruit I got from like a delivery from Whole Foods, a bunch of fruit. I just wanted to keep eating that way because I felt good. And that jacked my blood sugar up quite a lot. Eating it in Miami was like, it wasn't local food, even though food should have been grown there. It was
Right.
clearly food that was trucked in from thousands of miles away, different countries, et cetera. I went to Costa Rica after that. It was all food that we would go to the grocery store every day around noon because that's when they would get their shipment in for the day, and then they would sell out of everything by like 6 o'clock.
Wow.
They got everything locally every single day that would do new shipments. It was like the most ideal food setup. It was like a mini Whole Foods and everything you would want. Super cheap grass-fed meat that was local. And then all the produce was like trucked in every day from like the surrounding towns. So the blood glucose response after that fruit was then back to normal. Again, tons of different variables here. I'm not isolating it and saying that it has to be the food difference, but like obviously the food tasted way better, was way more ripe, and was from the actual area that it was. I thought it was interesting. Like I just like didn't want to eat the fruit in Miami. It tasted like shit. It was like it was like a disconnect in my brain. Like what, this isn't what I'm supposed to be eating right now.
Right.
Whereas when I'm at Costa Rica, I was like, oh yeah, this is appropriate for me to eat this. And so like that's just been a theme of, again, how I've been approaching nutrition is what can I find that's locally produced, and then trimming it down within that of like which vegetables I'm going to have, which fruits I'm going to have, what meat, animal products, whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think if you just use it as a heuristic of what is produced around me, it just simplifies everything. And I've been saying this for a long time, eat locally, but it really does just fix a lot of the questions that people should have around nutrition.
For sure. I mean, if you have a farmer's market, if you're fortunate enough to have a farmer's market around you, which I know not everybody does, then, just going there and just shopping, what's available and seeing how that changes throughout the season. Like this has been, I'd say the last 2 years has been the first time that me and my wife have both consistently been going to the farmer's market. Like every week we're doing it out in Austin and we're doing it back here. And it's really cool to like, even the different recipes that we get to cook because of doing that, where it's like, all right, let's just go. We go to the farmer's market. We just get what looks good there. Like you said, kind of within the foods that we know we like and work. And then we get to try new recipes because, there's, this new vegetable or this new fruit that's available this time of year that's not usually. So I think that's a good way for people to do it too. It's just like, if you have a farmer's market, go there, shop. If you're eating locally, you're going to be solving a lot of the problems. And that's what you always talk about too, is like, rather than overcomplicating stuff, like if we could just go that fresh, local, seasonal approach, then you're probably going to be solving most of your health issues.
And it's more cheap. Like it's way cheaper to eat locally than it is to buy other stuff. Even if you're like, okay, if we're removing eating like processed Pop-Tarts, stuff like that, where it's $1 for a box of bullshit, then yeah, okay, I don't consider that food.
Right.
So if you're talking about real food, like even if you go to a Safeway, H-E-B, like one of these Kroger, one of these big box grocery stores, and compare it to most farmers markets, you can get way cheaper stuff at farmers markets.
For sure. Well, even with a lot of that processed stuff, I mean, like a box of cereal costs a few bucks. Like a carton of eggs is less than that. Like it's like, I think that in a lot of cases, of course, if you're getting like extra stuff at the grocery store, like, sodas and like all these like snack foods and stuff, like, you're not gonna like, that's definitely going to have costs if you're trying to go like healthy versions of that. But if you're just getting like whole foods, like when we go to the farmer's market, it'll cost us like $10 to get produce for the week. Like for both me and my wife, it'd be like 10, like I think the most we've ever spent there has probably been like, $18 on produce. And that's when we've gotten like blueberries and strawberries or something like, so it's just like, the meat can be a little bit more expensive, but there's obviously a lot of solutions to that too. You can buy in bulk, go in with people and do that. So, but still like, if we're going in and we're getting produce for a few bucks, then we're able, and that's, most of our meals are just a produce and a meat, then it's like we can spend extra on, good quality meat because we're not getting all of the extra junk. So yeah, it is definitely cheaper. All right. Next question. We're just talking about vegetables, so let's get into those. Are there any veggies you generally avoid or deskin, deseed, or ferment?
I would say like more of the nightshade family is what I stay away from.
Mhm.
Yeah, nothing that like I specifically avoid. I tend to eat more fleshy fruits and tubers and choose that just because I just ask the question like, what's the point of eating other vegetables? It's basically like when I think about it, I'm thinking about okay, I want from macronutrient perspective, I'm thinking about how am I get my protein or my energy source, and then how am I getting my micronutrients on top of that. And I'm eating a lot of organ meat pretty often, daily, I'd say. And then so it's like between the meat and the organs, I feel like I'm getting a lot of the micronutrition. And so I'm not really looking to for plants to do that. Like whatever it comes from the plants, it's great, it's an additive. And so if you're looking at fibrous plants, especially ones that have oxalates and other weird things in them, like nightshade family, I just don't really see the point of them other than just mouth pleasure, which is fine. Like I don't go out of my way to avoid them if they're in a meal. And I'm not really as crazy about it as some other people are. I think that people should be able to eat vegetables and not have crazy reactions to them. And I think that, I mean, this is another thing about going to see the odds. It's like they lived a very certain way. I think Paul had some takeaways that sort of solidified a lot of his biases, but we saw a lot of other people on that trip and have researched since then, a lot of other cultures who eat only plant foods and who are just as healthy. And so I think to me, it's less of a focus on a carnivorous diet and more of a focus on humans really flourish if they eat real food,
Mhm.
local to them. And it can be high in plants, it can be low in plants, it can be all these other things. And yeah, plants are much more different than what animals are now versus 100,000 years ago, for sure. And there's no denying that. But I don't think that that's what we need to be focused on or worried about. I think if you're a resilient human, you should be able to handle eating a tomato without having an autoimmune flare up.
Right.
And I think that if that's the case, then your gut is probably not in a good condition. Your biochemistry inside is not functioning appropriately. It should be able to handle that tomato.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that there's a lot of good frameworks for this. I mean, if you are working through some of that stuff, I think a modified carnivore approach can work really well. I think as salesy as Dave Asprey gets and how much flack he's taken for all of his products, his bulletproof products, it's like the plan he made with his bulletproof diet is a really good sort of spectrum of green to red foods. So, I mean, that's a really good focus. Just general paleo templates are great. But yeah, I don't necessarily put the hard X on any certain vegetables, but there's ones that I prefer. Like if we're going for fibrous foods and especially like leafy greens, things like that, like you're basically just not eating something else.
Mhm.
And then so you're just displacing an energy source via a carb or a fat or a protein. And I'd rather get foods that do something for me than foods that don't.
Right.
So that's kind of how I think about it. What about
Yeah.
yourself?
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. Like, definitely view my nutrition the same as you, where it's like, if I'm eating a vegetable, it's usually just like that's the side that I've decided to pair with that meat. I don't really look at it from a nutrition perspective that much. I feel like, meat and organ meat are moving the needle the most in the nutrient department. So, I don't really have any, and I've never really found that there's, avoiding certain vegetables has moved the needle much for me. But I've
Mhm.
also never really had a lot of, gut health issues or anything like that. I do think that for most people out there, this is probably a little bit too far down. Like, there's so many other things that you should fix about your diet before you start getting into the nitty gritty of like nightshade vegetables and all of that stuff, with the exception of certain autoimmune conditions, right? I mean, there's some people who, if you have a problem digesting the stuff, then there's something you need to do about it. But, again, if you're eating the standard American diet, let's focus on fixing that before we start focusing on which vegetables you should or shouldn't have. So that's kind of the way that I look at it. But yeah, for me, there's really nothing that I, try to stick away from too much. I don't really like doing legumes that much, I guess. I guess you don't know if you consider it a
I
veggie or
don't,
not, but
yeah, I
like,
don't eat those. I don't
yeah,
basically, yeah, I eat very few beans, uh,
yeah,
no beans, no grains, none of that stuff. So a paleo-ish template again, whatever's whatever's at the farmer's market locally that can
yeah,
spoil that week is what I eat.
right,
That's kind of like the an easy way people can think about it as well. It's like, okay, is it a bag of rice, uncooked rice at the farmer's market? Okay, yeah, maybe even if it's still like sort of regional or local, fine, eat it. I don't care. But how I think about it is, what will spoil at this farmer's market in
right.
a week from now, 2 weeks from
Hmm.
now? Like that's what I consume. Food that's boiled.
Right.
And
Yeah.
food that's fresh. And so like, I mean, sometimes I just go and whatever looks good. I think that you can use that barometer as well when you're shopping locally and things are fresh. Use your intuition. Yeah. And so sometimes I'll eat way more carbohydrates because it looks good, and I'm craving eating a bunch of whatever berries. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, nothing that I specifically avoid. There is
Yeah. I like,
go ahead.
what's that? No, go ahead.
Oh no, finish that up because I'm going on another thought.
Okay. No, I was just going to say, I like that approach of kind of like letting your eyes do some of the thinking for you. Like, obviously you can't do that in a grocery store with all the marketing that's going on there. But when you're talking about a farmer's market, you can. And I think like picking out foods that look delicious to you, like me and my wife have both definitely noticed that when we go through like the produce section at the farmer's market in the summertime when it's hot, like we definitely like are looking at more of like the berries and like the fruits and stuff like that. And then in like the wintertime when it's cold, we're looking at more of like the green vegetables and like, sweet potatoes and things like that. So I definitely think that can be a good gauge once you started to repair a little bit of the way you look at food and everything, right? I mean, if you're somebody who's like a sugarholic and that's what you're addicted to, like, you're probably not going to be able to use that approach yet. But if you've kind of have some, general guidelines for how you should and shouldn't eat, then I think that can be a good approach.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I have started to avoid recently that has been a new thing for me is dairy.
Mm-hmm.
I've had no problems with dairy over the last 6 to 8 months, especially. I've been dealing with this mold problem in my house.
Mm-hmm.
Having tons of symptoms. I'll cover it in a couple podcasts as people scheduled to talk about it. But had noticed that dairy was giving me a bunch of weird skin issues.
Mm.
And so I don't know if the mold, I tested a bunch of gut stuff, nothing in there. So I don't know if there's some cross reactivity with casein or whey or something like that. But yeah, even I mean, high fat stuff like butter's not a problem, but even cream and cheese, like I'm getting these like weird scalp dryness and itchiness.
Wow.
Cut dairy out, totally fine. Add it back in, problem. Cut it out, totally fine. I talked to Paul about this. He said he has a similar thing, and it flares up his eczema and has a similar scalp thing. So yeah, who knows after I get rid of this mold issue if it will be fine. But that is something I am avoiding recently, even though it's not a vegetable.
Nice. All right, next question. Let's see. What is your go-to breakfast?
Yeah. Right now, I'm not eating much breakfast. I am just going into, basically.
Bring yourself, dude. Come on.
Well, I'm living the keto lifestyle.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. You're in ketosis, so it's cool.
And so I go to picnic and get typically a iced mocha, 16 ounce decaf, no maple. That's
Mine mocha?
No mine. Just regular.
Oh.
And that comes with cacao butter and butter blended in. And that lasts me until, I don't know, I haven't eaten since then. So what is that? 6 hours?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm typically good till like a early afternoon lunch and then dinner later. But yeah, that's it. And I think that's kind of been a consistent thing too. Like whenever I'm busy, I usually revert to a super high fat, moderate to low protein. Even if I eat protein, I think that it makes me hungrier sooner than if I just eat the fat. And just diving into a lot of this stearic acid stuff with how it relates to certain enzymes and satiation and all this stuff has been super fascinating. So cacao butter in there does that trick. But yeah, that's kind of like the breakfast that I'm going to recently. So if I'm super hungry, I'll pop in a frittata, or they have these tacos that are made with grass-fed beef, sausage, eggs, and siete tortillas. So that's a quick, like if I'm going to the farm or doing something in the day, I'll grab one of those. I'm homeless right now, and this is why like I'm not cooking much in the morning. So like we're just staying in between friends places, hotels, whatever. It's chaotic. So it's usually a picnic. I don't eat out every day like that in the morning typically, but that's what it's been like recently.
Dude, you're making me hungry. That was my favorite spot in Austin. Like it's actually the last place I was in right before I left Austin. We went there.
That's right. We met.
Yeah, that's great. I think that I would love to have you talk just like briefly on the stearic acid thing, because I definitely agree with like if you're trying to keep hunger in check, like what you do for breakfast should be determined by what you're trying to do that day, right? Like if I'm trying to like really sit down and like get laser focused with work and stuff, I'm not going to be consuming carbs and stuff in the morning. They're going to, be spiking my blood sugar and sending that, the hunger waves coming. So fat is definitely the approach that I go for that too. But what is it with stearic acid? So that stearic acid itself is what's signaling something with satiety?
Yeah. So stearic acid's 18 carbon fatty acids, saturated. And basically when your body oxidizes it, it creates energy from it, your mitochondria. It will create more backup in complex 2 electron transport chain. So it's called the F to N ratio. So FADH2 brings it through this complex to CoQ10, and then the electron gets backed up there. That creates hydrogen peroxide, and the electron basically flows back and this reverse electron transport, creates hydrogen peroxide. That creates insulin resistance at the adipose cell. And basically tells then that also goes to the hypothalamus and helps secrete leptin, and then that downregulates this enzyme in the endoplasmic reticulum called SED1. So like there's a complex of things, but generally it tells like it's this very clean mechanism. So both stearic acid and palmitic acid, so palmitic acid C16, fully saturated, those both specifically play a role in advancing this sort of loop through the mitochondria to say like, okay, we have enough energy, gives a little bit of physiological insulin resistance to the adipose cell, tissue. So that way you're not storing fat. And so when that's open, when insulin sensitive, when the adipose cell has insulin sensitivity, basically like that also is a loop that through the rest of your body goes through and says, okay, this is still open. Therefore, we should be storing energy. We don't have enough energy. We're not releasing energy. But if it's closed off, your body will then start releasing free fatty acids in your bloodstream shortly after that. And there's like some really interesting papers that have explored stearic acid specifically and shown this just crazy effect, especially when compared to oleic acid, which is 18-1, C18-1, which is monounsaturated fatty acid. So it has one double bond, and then linoleic acid 18-2, which is just 2 double bonds. So stearic, oleic, and linoleic are all sort of the same structure, just with 2 double bonds or 1 double bond or 0 double bonds. So this is just again, I'm nerding out of the stuff recently, and you can't tell, and super into it. So this is probably going to go over a lot of people's heads if they aren't up on the biochemistry, but it's the results of people eating that, they've done mice studies and done human studies with this stuff. The difference is remarkable as far as satiation and also lean mass. So like mice fed stearic acid pellets instead of soybean, but like just that fat versus just monounsaturated versus linoleic. It's like one is sort of like what you would say average pudgy person. Stearic acid is like basically the mice have 6 packs, and then the linoleic acid, the mice are obese, just from changing that one fatty acid.
Wow.
Which is pretty telling. There's a lot of other papers I could link to. Like one's they've had somebody go on a vegan diet, a bunch of people go on a vegan diet for 2 days. They came in, gave them a milkshake with bananas and stearic acid, basically. And they showed mitochondrial fusion immediately. And basically like it kickstarts mitochondrial production, like has them actually focus on like creating appropriate reactive oxygen species. A lot of fascinating stuff with stearic acid. And I think that again, I don't think it needs to be some crazy addition. I think it's pretty prevalent in animal foods. This is where we got most of our fat in the past.
Right.
Nearly all of our fat. So I think it's just something that like we have an omission of now, and we've replaced it with industrially processed seed oils. And that's a problem. And so just trying to get more of it back. I think that there's probably, when people eat more vegetable oils, more linoleic acid gets stored in their tissues, they're going to need basically a higher amount of stearic acid to sort of reverse some of these things. But
right. I think the two things that's super well. Thank you for the biochemistry lesson too. Appreciate that. Next time, use that whiteboard behind you to map that out for me. I think the two things that are super interesting about that is like one, that seems to have had played a big role in why we saw increases in obesity when we saw decreases in, animal protein intake and increases in, vegetable fat intake. Like that's had to have been a huge thing there. And I think it's also pretty funny that like, obviously the old adage was that, fat would make you fat. And we know that that's not true. But now it's like, when you hear that, it's like, no, there's actually mechanisms in some fats that actually will prevent you from getting fat. So not only is it not going to get you fat, it's going to potentially like help you lose more weight, which I think is super interesting. It's so counterintuitive to what we've thought.
Yeah. Again, like, I don't think it's going to like magically help someone lose weight if they are a normal human. Like
Right.
if the human is already having normal physiology
Mm-hmm.
because of their normal environment,
Right.
it wouldn't be a big deal if you added more of it to a diet because it would be naturally occurring into it. Like
Right.
the only reason it helps people lose fat is because people are fat and we shouldn't be fat.
Right.
And that's just the way it is. And go ahead, people can cancel me for that one. It's like humans should be relatively lean.
Right.
And so like we have this new normal that, yeah, it's surprising that that would be the case and would help people lose fat. Again, we were talking about earlier, like losing fat shouldn't, like that's just an indication of a physiological problem, like of a pathology. Like humans shouldn't need to lose fat. No other organism that's alive needs to lose fat unless we make them fat with artificial foods. Period.
Right.
Period. And this is like sort of again my main defense when people say I'm fat shaming people. Like I'm not saying people are bad people because they're fat. I'm saying having obesity is a pathology.
Right. Well, I mean, it characterizes all of the most common chronic conditions, right? It's like it's diabetes, it's insulin, it's obesity, obviously, like cardiovascular disease, like all of those things. Like, I think it's crazy that it could be considered fat shaming to just say that, somebody who has a high body fat percentage has a greater percent chance of having disease and is typically a more unhealthy person, right?
Yeah. In having like being obese is unhealthy. It's like, it's not a normal representation of what a human species should be.
Right.
And like, again, I have been very fat in my life. I had the photos to prove it. It was a huge problem for me. I understand how hard it is. So, I mean, it's another example of like, I'm not trying to shame people, but there's a reality where we need to discuss the ramifications of improper physiology and the downstream effects of that.
Right.
Yeah. And being silenced for doing so is insane.
Well, we'll let the fact checkers decide that. Okay, buddy, we'll let them decide.
Another interesting thing, Brad and I were doing a podcast the other day, Brad Marshall of Fire in a Bottle, and he was mentioning that, again, it's one of these many things going down this rabbit hole of remembering all of this crazy biochemistry. But when humans are fed, he was talking about the study where they basically took out all fats, fed humans only carbohydrates, sugar. And in this case, humans can only produce, and this is the case for most mammals, 3 fatty acids when they don't have any other fat intake. And it's stearic acid, C18 saturated fat, palmitic acid, which is C16 saturated fat, and oleic acid, C18, which is monosaturated fat, which is just needed to basically keep the membranes pliable. And so you can have monosaturated fat, so that way you can have fluidity in your cells. And so why the hell would we think that literally if you don't eat fat, your body takes glucose and makes 2 saturated fat molecules? Why would we think that those are bad for humans? If our body makes it endogenously, how the hell could that be bad?
Right. That's crazy.
You know what it can't make?
What?
Linoleic acid.
Wow.
Yeah. And so when we eat an excess amount of it, basically the body's like, what the hell is going on here? This is like screwing everything up. Like our signaling mechanisms are all messed up. Mm-hmm. It causes so much chaos, and like it spreads to so many different areas of the body. But you'll get your RCT police out there and saying that there's not enough evidence about it. But again, if you understand the mechanisms and you understand the science, it's pretty clear that, this is not a food we should be eating in excess.
Well, I think the fact that your body makes it if you don't consume it is a pretty telltale sign that it's an essential nutrient for our bodies, right? And that it plays a major role.
Not only that's essential, but like it can't be bad for you.
Right. If your body literally makes it when it doesn't have it, like,
right.
Can't be bad. And I think I know we have a question on here about pregnancy advice, and this kind of leads into that, but like, it's funny, I had this, when me and my wife went to our first doctor's appointment, we had like our first ultrasound and everything. And we're sitting in there with the doctor, and the doctor's telling us about nutrition advice. Right. So, and, I'm obviously sitting there just like, oh, I can't wait for this. Like, what kind of advice are we going to be getting? And one of the advices was to avoid trans fat, which obviously that's a good thing. And then to avoid saturated fat because it was, quote, bad for the baby is what they said. And I literally asked her, and I was like, do you know what breast milk is made out of? Like breast milk is literally like over 50% of the fats found in breast milk is saturated fat. Like it's the most essential nutrient that like a child or a developing baby should have. You know what I mean? So like isn't that crazy?
Or you could ask them, do you know what cellular membranes are made of?
Right.
Do you know what the nervous system is made of? Do you know what the brain is comprised of?
Right.
And the crazy thing about saturated fat, and I talked about this in the episode with Brad as well, is that I did some research about this with breast milk, and we have a baby formula industry that the FDA sets standards on based upon their measurements of breast milk. However, those measurements of breast milk are done on average women around the US. Those average women obviously are consuming high amounts of polyunsaturated fatty acids and linoleic acid. So the FDA goes, okay, let's sample some breast milk from some women and look what's inside of it. Again, we don't make linoleic acid, but linoleic acid is a high amount of the research that the FDA has done on women's breast milk. And so it's in there because we've been eating soybean oil and all this other shit. And so it's high. So then the government goes, oh, it's in the breast milk, so we should feed its babies.
Wow.
And so in hunter-gatherer populations, there's actually a study that shows this. I think it's like 3 to 5% of linoleic acid, which is a normal amount that you should get eating all foods. So all foods are going to, you're going to have a little bit of it. You shouldn't be avoiding it to 0%, or shouldn't even try. It's not even really that possible.
Right.
But this is like 10, 20, 30, 40% in other populations that consume it more, which then the government takes that and then requires that in baby formula and then informs all this other stuff. But yeah, I mean, saturated fat, again, even women who are fed terrible food is in normal breast milk. And so again, like if this is what mammals make so that the offspring can survive and thrive, why would you avoid those foods otherwise? It's insane proposition.
Such a disconnect there too. Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't know that too. Like, I knew that the baby food and the baby formula industry was really bad and, a ton of like canola oil and vegetable oil and stuff like that. But I just assumed that was because, that's just packaged food industry in general is a ton of that stuff. I didn't realize that it was rooted in such bad science. That's horrible.
Yeah. Because I looked at it and I'm like, man, I should probably make a baby formula company because no one's doing this. And so there's several different things you have to go through hoops. One of them is to do like a 2-year study showing that babies don't die given your formulas.
Wow.
But to get to that point, you have to prove to the FDA that your formula meets their standards based upon their research of women who are sick, like the average American population. Like, I don't want to feed my kids stuff that makes them look like and operate like the average American population.
Right. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. Like, obviously, it would make sense to be like, why wouldn't we? If we're going to be using that as a baseline for how to formulate that product, why wouldn't we be testing, the healthiest of women, right? Like we should be taking the best of the best, and like that should be the baseline, right? Not the average.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the only place we see this. We see this in lab work as well. Like labs, the reference ranges are on people who go get blood work.
Right.
And so, okay, first of all, people who go get blood work are sick to begin with. Right. That's why they go get it, because people don't do it preventatively most of the time. Right. Second of all, the average American is so sick that you're getting the sickest of the sick, and then you're creating reference ranges on these people and saying this is what a normal, healthy human should be. Reference ranges and blood work drive me fucking nuts.
Well, it's like you said, our perception of what's healthy has completely changed now. And like, I mean, we saw this a lot during COVID too, where they would show like, quote, young, healthy people dying from COVID. And then you would see the person, you'd be like, okay, maybe they weren't diagnosed with the disease, but like they weren't a healthy person, right? Like we've completely changed what our, what we deem healthy nowadays. Like I don't know, it's crazy. And it's crazy that
we can't talk about it. We can't talk about what being unhealthy is, because then you'll be labeled a fat shame or get canceled like I did.
Right.
Sorry. Okay. Let's wrap up on this. So there's one quick question: how necessary is fiber in the diet? I'll just answer that by saying not at all. Covered that before. And then any pregnancy advice? Talk to your doctor. Seems like outdated advice, and I agree with that. I think that like talk to your doctor, like you've witnessed, is not helpful. I think people are caught in this little weird in between where doctors are no longer credible and they get their information from the internet, where you have a bunch of charlatans who are also not credible. So who do you trust and how do you figure this out? So I am less qualified in this arena because I don't have a kid and Martha isn't pregnant, but your wife is. So maybe you should take this one.
As I would label myself as barely qualified, still in the learning process, but I actually have so right when I found out Sarah was pregnant, I started looking up resources and came across this book, which is Real Food Pregnancy by Lily Nichols. And this was a really cool resource because there was just a ton of research in it. And like, it really debunked a lot of like, this person saying seems like outdated advice. That's exactly what it did. It started going through and like debunking a lot of the common advice that we give women during pregnancy. You hear so often people talking about, you need to have this many carbs and you need to have this and you need to cut this stuff out. But it's like, it's really rooted in like just bad information. Like, really it's more about like nutrients, right? It's like, we want to make sure that we're providing enough nutrients. And, we have this misunderstanding of where nutrients come from, which leads to, misunderstanding of what the proper diet is for somebody who's pregnant. So this book really kind of like lays it out more of like, and really it's whole foods. Like that's the thing here is it's meat, it's organ meat, it's leafy green vegetables, low glycemic fruits, but not demonizing carbohydrates or anything like that. Just, talking about the importance of making sure that you're keeping carbs in check so that you're avoiding the gestational diabetes that we see is like just booming now, like the increase in the last 20 to 30, like, pregnancy nutrition, the problem used to be undernutrition. Now it's overnutrition is what's become, more of an issue now. So this book really maps a lot of that out. And, for somebody who has a pretty good understanding of nutrition, there was a lot of stuff that I learned in there too. Like one of the big ones was I was worried about organ meat, like wanted to give organ meat to my wife, but wanted, was because of the nutrients and everything that are in there, but had heard about, vitamin A toxicity and like all these things that I was like worried about. And, this book kind of went in and talked about how, the studies that are done that are, showing vitamin A toxicity, that's with like supplemental vitamin A, which is a lot different than, the vitamin A that you're getting in whole food form when it's coming with other essential nutrients like vitamin D. So just like little things like that. So, the short answer to that is that I'm still learning a bunch, but if you're looking for, pregnancy nutrition advice, I think this is a really incredible resource that's a lot more up to date than what you're going to get from your doctor.
Yeah. And I don't know how much stuff is specifically in there, but I would have to bet that most of it falls in this bucket of if you just ate a normal human diet, you wouldn't have to worry about it.
Totally. And that's why when I started reading it, I was expecting to be blown away. Like, hey, this is, like learn something new. This is what you should be eating. And really it's kind of exactly what I would assume. It's like, these are real foods, eat real nutrient dense foods that are, like grown around you. Like that. I think the interesting part of the book is the science part that they tell you, but the application of it is really what we just talked about this whole episode, which is eating real foods grown around you.
Love it, man. Well, Big Daddy Irv coming in hot. All your pregnancy tips, go through this guy, Ketologist.
Yeah, I'm actually, I've already started a little bit, but I'm going to be putting some info out on social media, just highlighting the stuff I'm learning along the way. So be on the lookout for that.
I'm sure it'll be fantastic, Chris. All right, brother. Well, thank you for coming on today. Let's do this again. I would love to, there's been a lot of questions that have popped up since the last time we've done this. So I think we have a backlog of maybe a couple more we could do.
Yeah.
We'll have you on and keep ripping through.
Sounds good, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, brother. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.